The night was cold and the colony streets were almost empty. A thin layer of dust moved with the wind, scratching against broken walls. Old neon signs flickered in silence, some showing half-dead words that no one cared to read anymore. Thomas, the human janitor, walked back from his late shift. He was tired. His hands smelled of cleaning chemicals, and his back ached from hours of scrubbing floors that no one ever noticed. All he wanted was to sit in his small metal room, eat the bread he had saved, and close his eyes. He carried a small paper bag under his arm. Inside was one loaf of bread, not fresh, not soft, but food. It was his dinner and maybe also his breakfast for tomorrow. For a man like him, who earned very little, every bite of food mattered. As he crossed a narrow alley, Thomas heard something, a faint sound like a soft footstep or maybe just the wind. He stopped, his eyes searching the shadows. For a moment nothing moved, but then he saw it. Small fingers reached out from behind a broken crate. In a flash, the paper bag was gone from his arm. Thomas spun around, shocked. A small figure ran ahead, clutching the bread tightly to his chest. It was not a human child. The boy's skin was pale blue, glowing faintly under the moonlight. His arms were thin, his clothes torn, and his legs moved as if they had no strength left. But still, he ran, desperate, holding on to the bread like it was treasure. For a moment, Thomas felt anger. This bread was all he had, the only thing waiting for him after a long day. But then he noticed something strange. The boy did not look back in fear. He only looked forward, as if someone else was waiting for him, as if the bread was not stolen for himself. But for another, Thomas's heart beat faster. Why would an alien child be wandering alone in this part of the colony? Why risk stealing from a human? The streets were dangerous and punishment for theft was harsh. No child would take that risk unless there was no other choice. The boy stumbled, almost falling, but he kept running. Thomas followed, his boots echoing. Against the stone ground, he did not shout, did not call for guards. Instead, something inside him whispered, "Follow him." The alley turned darker as the boy slipped into deeper corners of the colony. The smell of damp metal and old smoke filled the air. Lights grew weaker, shadows stretched longer. Every step Thomas took pulled him further from safety. Yet he did not stop. He could hear the boy's ragged breathing ahead. Each cough sounded painful, each step weaker. Still, the boy refused to let go of the bread. It was clear now. This was not just hunger. This was survival. For a brief moment, Thomas saw the boy's face in the glow of a broken lamp. Large eyes, shining like liquid, silver filled with fear but also determination. Cheeks hollow, lips dry, hands trembling as he clutched the bread tighter. Thomas felt a sharp sting inside his chest. This was no thief. This was a starving child. He slowed his pace, keeping a little distance. He wanted to see where the boy was going. Something told him this was not the end of the story. The missing bread was only the beginning. The colony was silent around them. Every shadow seemed alive. Every turn of the alley whispered with secrets. Thomas knew he should turn back. It was foolish to chase into unknown territory, but his feet kept moving, guided by something stronger than fear, curiosity, and maybe even compassion. The boy disappeared behind a pile of scrap metal. Thomas quickened his steps. When he reached the spot, the alley ahead was empty. Only the sound of faint coughing lingered. He looked around, searching, heart pounding, and then he saw it. A narrow opening between two collapsed walls. Too small for a grown man, but just enough for a child to slip through. Thomas bent down, staring into the dark hole. The sound of tiny voices echoed from inside, not one, but several. Hungry, tired voices, waiting, hoping. The bread was gone. But in that moment, Thomas realized he had found something far bigger than his lost meal. He had stumbled into a secret, one that would change everything. And as the cold night wrapped around him, Thomas whispered to himself, "This is not just about bread anymore." Thomas stood frozen by the narrow opening. The sound of voices inside still echoed in his ears. It was not just one child, it was many. And the bread he had lost was now their only food for the night. For a moment he thought about leaving. It was not his problem. He was just a janitor, a tired man with no family, no power, no reason to get involved. But something inside him refused to let go. He could not forget the hollow cheeks of that alien boy, nor the silver eyes that had looked more desperate than guilty. Thomas turned, stepping away. But then he heard a cough, sharp and weak. It was the boy's cough. And before he knew it, his feet moved again. He circled the wall, searching for another way inside. If there were more children, he needed to see them with his own eyes. The alley stretched further, darker. Rusting pipes dripped water that smelled of iron. Old machines lay broken, their insides picked clean by scavengers. The colony lights were faint here, buzzing weakly. The place felt abandoned, but Thomas knew it wasn't. Ahead, he saw movement. The boy again, slipping out from another crack between the walls, still holding the bread tight. The boy turned, his head, his silver eyes widening when he saw Thomas, and then he ran faster than before. Thomas sighed, half in frustration, half in concern. "Kid, I don't want to hurt you," he whispered under his breath, but the boy was already gone. His small feet tapped against the stone ground, echoing in the empty alley. Thomas followed, his boots heavy but steady. The chase had begun. The alley bent into long turns, some filled with piles of trash, others with strange shadows, rats scattered at their steps. Once a mechanical crawler, broken and blind, jerked to life as the boy passed, but it fell silent again when Thomas approached. The boy coughed as he ran. He stumbled once, almost dropping the bread. Thomas could have caught him then, but he didn't. He only slowed his pace, following like a shadow he wanted to understand, not to punish. Every corner of the alley whispered stories of hunger. Graffiti marked the walls. Old warnings. Forgotten promises. The air grew colder the deeper they went. The smell of decay was strong, mixed with smoke from hidden fires. The boy turned sharply into a narrow passage. Thomas followed, his shoulders scraping against the damp wall. The passage opened into another alley, even darker. For a moment, Thomas lost sight of the boy. Panic struck him. Had he lost him for good? Then he saw it. A faint glow ahead. The boy's skin shimmered in the darkness, almost like a dim lantern. His small frame darted between shadows, but every step looked weaker, every breath heavier. Thomas realized the boy was not only hungry, he was sick. Something was breaking him down from the inside, and yet he still ran with all his strength as if his life depended on it. Maybe it did. The alley sloped downward, leading into what looked like an old maintenance tunnel. Thomas hesitated. He knew these tunnels. They were dangerous, filled with broken wires and unstable walls. No sane person walked there at night, but the boy did not stop, and Thomas could not stop either. As they entered the tunnel, the sounds of the colony faded. It was quiet now, only the echo of footsteps and the boy's cough. Water dripped from above. The walls were covered in mold, glowing faintly in patches. The air was damp and heavy. The boy glanced back once. His eyes met Thomas's, not with fear, but with warning, as if telling him, "Do not follow, human." This path is not yours, but Thomas kept going. Something inside him said this chase was not about bread anymore. It was about truth, about something hidden beneath the colony's silence. The boy slipped through another broken grate. Thomas pushed it aside and entered too. Now, the space opened into a wide underground chamber, and what Thomas saw froze him in place. It was not just the boy, it was dozens of alien children, thin, starving, their glowing eyes reflecting in the darkness like broken stars. They turned to look at him. Some hissed in fear, others clutched each other tighter, and in the middle the boy placed the bread down. Their eyes lit with fragile hope. Thomas's heart sank. The chase was over, but his real journey had just begun. The underground chamber was silent except for the soft sound of breathing. Dozens of glowing eyes stared at Thomas, wide with fear and suspicion. The children were not older than 10 or 12, some even smaller. They looked like shadows of what they should have been. Bones pressed against thin blue skin, cheeks hollow, arms trembling. The bread the boy had stolen lay in the center. He had placed it carefully, as if it were something holy. The other children gathered close, but none touched it yet. They waited, their silver eyes darting between the bread and the human stranger standing in the doorway. Thomas froze. He did not know what to do. His mind told him to step back, to leave this place before the guards found him here, but his heart felt heavy, almost breaking. This was not a crime scene. This was a tragedy. The boy who had stolen the bread stepped forward. His chest rose and fell quickly, his cough rattling inside him, but still, he stood between Thomas and the other children, like a protector, even though he was the weakest of them all. He raised his small hand, signaling the others not to be afraid. Thomas slowly lifted his palms, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not here to take it back," he whispered, his voice echoing softly in the chamber. The children did not move, their eyes filled with disbelief. Perhaps they had only known humans as guards, as traitors, as people who looked away, never as someone who might speak gently. The boy bent down and tore a small piece from the bread. He handed it to the smallest child, a girl whose eyes were too big for her tiny face. She held it carefully, like it was more precious than gold. She sniffed it, then bit slowly, her lips shaking. Tears filled her glowing eyes, but she did not cry out loud. She only chewed in silence, as if afraid the bread would vanish if she made a sound. One by one, the boy gave small pieces to the others. Each child received only a bite. There was not enough for full stomachs, but there was enough for hope. Their thin shoulders relaxed. Their hollow faces softened for a moment. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He had never seen hunger this raw, this painful. Not even during the worst shortages after the war. He leaned against the damp wall, watching. His mind raced with questions. Where are their parents? Why are they here? Why is no one helping them? When the last crumb was gone, silence filled the chamber again. The boy turned his silver eyes back to Thomas. For the first time, Thomas noticed how much weight those eyes carried. Not the look of a child, but of someone who had been forced to grow old too soon. The boy pointed weakly toward the exit. It was not anger, not threat, but warning. He wanted Thomas to leave. Humans did not belong here. Humans meant danger, but Thomas did not move. His boots were heavy, his chest heavier. He could not just walk away. He wanted to speak, to ask, but words felt useless here. So instead, he reached into his pocket. He had one thing left from his day, a small wrapped bar. It was not much, just something he had saved from his lunch. He placed it carefully on the ground, sliding it forward. The children gasped softly, their glowing eyes widening. None dared touch it at first, until the boy stepped forward and picked it up. He looked at Thomas again. This time not with fear, but with something softer, confusion, maybe even gratitude. Thomas gave a small nod. "I'll come back," he whispered, more to himself than to them. The boy tilted his head, not understanding the words, but feeling their weight. The chamber was still, but in that stillness something had changed. As Thomas turned to leave, the sound of small whispers followed him, alien voices too soft to understand. But he knew they were speaking about him. He had crossed a line that no one else had dared to. He had seen what was hidden, and once seen, it could not be forgotten. When he stepped back into the alley, the cold air hit him like a wave. The colony lights flickered faintly above. For everyone else, the night was silent, ordinary. But for Thomas, the world had shifted. One stolen loaf of bread had revealed a secret far heavier than hunger. He walked back slowly, his mind burning. He thought of the leaders who had promised after the war to care for the alien survivors. He thought of the empty promises, the abandoned quarters, and now those forgotten children living in the dark, unseen, unfed, unloved. The bread was gone from his bag, but something far heavier had been placed in his heart, and Thomas knew, deep inside, he could never go back to being just a janitor again. Morning in the colony was never gentle. Metal shutters clanged open, vendors shouted prices no one could afford. The smell of smoke, Oil and cheap food filled the air. People moved quickly, heads down, chasing survival in a world that offered little. Thomas walked among them with heavy steps, his mind still trapped in the memory of the night. The glowing eyes of those starving children would not leave him. He had seen too much to forget, and now every face he passed looked different. Every human, every alien, seemed part of a bigger secret he had just uncovered. He reached the market square, a place alive with noise and color, but beneath it all, Thomas could feel something else. A tension, sharp and bitter. Humans and aliens stood on opposite sides of the stalls, trading but never trusting. The war had ended years ago, but the wound still bled silently. Thomas stopped at a food stall, his stomach empty. He had no bread now, no breakfast. The vendor, a heavy man with a sharp tongue, sneered at him. "Janitor, you're back again? Careful with your coins, food costs more than your pay these days." The crowd laughed lightly. Thomas forced a smile and turned away. He did not care about the insult, not today, but whispers followed him. Low voices, suspicious eyes. Someone had seen him last night. A shadow in the alleys had carried tales faster than the morning sun. "There he is, the human who walked with them," a woman muttered, "with the alien strays." Another hissed, "Maybe he's feeding them," a man added, his tone sharp. The crowd's eyes turned toward Thomas, not with kindness, but with something darker. Thomas froze. The market noise dimmed. He felt their stares pressing into his back like knives. He wanted to walk away, but his legs felt heavy. He turned slowly, meeting their eyes. "Yes," he said in a low voice. "I saw them." Gasps broke the air. Some laughed bitterly, others cursed. One man spat near his boots. "Those cursed things should have been cleared out after the war," he growled. "They drain resources, they bring disease," another said. "They are not children, they're a burden," someone else added. Thomas clenched his fists, anger burning in his chest. "They're starving," he said, his voice rising. "They're just kids with no one to care for them." But his words fell like stones into cold water. The crowd did not soften. Instead, the anger grew sharper. "Then let them starve," a woman snapped. "We can barely feed our own." "Humans first," someone shouted. "Humans always first," the others echoed. Thomas's heart pounded. He looked around at the faces, hard, angry, bitter, people broken by years of loss, by hunger and fear. They had no room left for compassion, and yet, he could not stay silent. "Those kids didn't choose the war," he said, his voice shaking, but strong. "They didn't choose to be left in the dark. We did that. Our leaders did that." Silence followed, heavy and sharp. The vendor leaned across his stall, eyes narrowing. "Careful, janitor," he hissed. "Talk like that, and you'll lose more than your job. You'll lose your place here." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some looked ready to push him out then and there. Fear wrapped around Thomas's chest. But beneath the fear, something stronger burned. Defiance. He turned and walked away. Not fast, not running, but steady. The stairs followed him. Some full of hatred, some of confusion. A few, just a few, were thoughtful, almost uncertain. When Thomas reached the edge of the market, he stopped to breathe. The noise of the crowd faded behind him, but their words stayed, cutting deeper than knives. "Humans first, humans always first," he whispered to himself. "If kindness has rules, then maybe I don't belong to their rules anymore." That night, when the colony lights dimmed, Thomas walked back to the alleys, back to the hidden tunnels. He carried a small bag of food, bought with what little he had left. Every step was heavy with risk. If the crowd saw him now, they would tear him apart. But he kept walking because he could not unsee their glowing eyes. He could not forget their hunger, and he knew, deep in his bones, that his life had already begun to change. The next day, Thomas could not shake the memory of the market. The sharp voices of the crowd still echoed in his ears. Their anger, their hatred, their refusal to see starving children as children. It cut deeper than hunger, deeper than loneliness. He walked to work with heavy steps, The hallways of the colony station smelled of rust and chemicals. He pushed his mop across the floor, but his mind was elsewhere. Images of hollow eyes and trembling hands returned again and again. He tried to bury them, but they rose stronger. By midday, he found himself in front of the old notice board. It was covered in faded posters, most torn or peeling, but one caught his eye. It showed the face of the colony governor, smiling wide. The bold letters below read, "We promise safety, food and care for all survivors, human and alien alike." Thomas stared at the words until his jaw tightened. A promise, he thought, but only words. A broken promise that no one cared to remember anymore. That night, when his shift ended, he sat in the mess hall. A few guards sat at another table laughing. Too loudly, their words carried across the room. "Those alien brats again," one sneered. "Heard some fool human went down there last night." Another chuckled. "Idiots. Doesn't he know the law? They're not citizens. They're shadows. Leave them to rot." Thomas's hands tightened around his cup. The liquid inside tasted sour. He wanted to stand, to shout, to remind them of the promise. But he knew, if he spoke here, he would not only lose his job, he might lose his freedom, maybe even his life. Later, when the hall was empty, Thomas slipped to the archives. As a janitor, no one cared if he cleaned late. No one watched him closely. He walked through rows of old boxes, stacks of forgotten papers. His flashlight shook in his hand, but his heart pushed him forward. At last he found it. A file marked post-war relief records. Dust covered the edges, the paper inside yellowed with age. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the pages. At first the words were hopeful. Lists of aid shipments, plans to rebuild, promises of housing, food, and education for alien orphans. But as the pages turned, the truth revealed itself. Lines were crossed out, numbers erased, entire shipments redirected. Food that was supposed to reach the alien survivors had been taken elsewhere. Resources for orphan shelters had been canceled, and then silence, no more records, as if those children had simply stopped existing. Thomas leaned against the shelf, his chest heavy. So it was true. The leaders had promised everything, but given nothing. They had abandoned those children, buried them in the shadows, and let time erase their names. He thought of the boy again, the one who stole his bread, thin arms, silver eyes filled with determination, a child born into lies, into betrayal. And Thomas whispered, "You deserved better." All of you deserved better. The sound of footsteps made him freeze. He quickly closed the file, sliding it back into the box. A guard passed the doorway, yawning. Thomas held his breath until the man was gone. Then he slipped out silently, his heart racing. Back in his small metal room, Thomas sat on his narrow bed. He stared at the cracked ceiling. The truth burned inside him like fire. The leaders had failed. The crowd had turned cruel. And now, the only line between life and death for those children was him. A janitor with nothing but tired hands and a stubborn heart. He rubbed his face and whispered, "Why me?" But deep inside he knew the answer. Because no one else cared. And sometimes one person was enough to begin. The next evening, Thomas walked again into the alleys. He carried a small bag of food, though it meant no dinner for himself. The children watched him with wide eyes as he entered the chamber. The boy stepped forward, coughing but still standing strong. This time, when Thomas set the bag down, the boy did not warn him away. Instead, he placed his thin hand on the food and looked. Up at Thomas there was no smile, not yet, but there was trust. A fragile, trembling trust. And in that moment Thomas made a silent vow. If the leaders had broken their promise, if the colony had chosen cruelty, then he would make his own promise, to keep coming back, to feed them, protect them, and carry the weight others had abandoned. It was not much. But in a world of broken promises, even one man's vow could change everything. The days turned into a quiet rhythm. By day, Thomas pushed his mop across the shiny floors of the colony station. By night, he carried food into the shadows. Every evening, his bag grew lighter, his stomach emptier, but the children's eyes, those glowing silver eyes, grew a little brighter. At first they only watched him, suspicious, afraid, silent. Every move he made felt heavy under their stares. But slowly, with each visit, their fear began to crack. One evening a small girl touched his sleeve. Her hand was thin, trembling. She whispered something in her alien tongue. A single word Thomas didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. And she smiled. A fragile smile that looked like the first flower blooming in winter. Food alone was not enough, Thomas knew. Bread and scraps filled bellies for a night, but hunger always returned sharper than before. So he began to bring other things. Bits of cloth stolen from the trash bins of the colony station. Broken tools he fixed in secret. Old blankets, buttons, even wire. Things no one cared for, but things that could become useful in small hands. The children gathered around him as he showed them how to patch torn clothes, how to tie scraps of fabric together to make something warmer. Their small fingers fumbled at first, but soon grew steady. They laughed softly when the knots held. Their eyes shone with something new, pride. Another night, Thomas brought a small broken lantern. Its wires were snapped, its bulb cracked, but he sat with them on the damp floor. He opened the lantern with careful hands, showing them how to strip wires, how to twist them, how to reconnect pieces. At first, the children only watched. Then the boy, the same one who had stolen his bread, stepped forward. He held the wire, copying Thomas's movements. His hands shook, but his eyes were sharp, determined. Together, they fixed it. And when the weak glow of light filled the chamber, the children gasped. For the first time, their darkness was pushed away by something they had made. The boy coughed hard, almost collapsing. But when Thomas steadied him, he only smiled faintly. It was not a smile of joy, but of strength, as if to say, "We can do this. We can survive." Thomas began to teach them little tricks humans used to survive in hard times. How to catch leaking water in small cans, how to make simple traps for rats, how to use fire safely without choking on the smoke. The children listened, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Every lesson was a spark of hope, every trick a weapon against the cruelty of hunger. And slowly, they began to trust him more. They no longer hissed when he entered. Some even whispered to each other as he walked in. One child started bringing him a cracked stone. Another showed him a shiny piece of metal. Small gifts, tokens of thanks, things worthless to the world, but priceless to Thomas. One evening, as he handed out bread, the boy finally spoke. His voice was weak but steady. Why?" he asked in broken human tongue. Thomas stared at him, caught off guard. Why? He wanted to answer that he didn't know, that maybe he was just foolish, but instead he said softly, "Because someone should." The boy's silver eyes studied him for a long time. Then he nodded, as if he understood more than the words, but danger was never far. One night, as Thomas left the tunnels, he heard voices above, guards walking close, their boots heavy, their laughter sharp. "Rumors of food going missing," one said. "A human helping them," another added. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, heart racing. If they caught him, the children would be left to starve again, and worse, the guards might follow him back. He waited until their voices faded. Then, he slipped into the darkness, his breath heavy, his chest tight. The risk was growing larger, but so was the bond. Each night he returned, each night the children grew stronger. The boy who had once stolen his bread now sat at his side. His cough was still there, but his eyes carried more fire. He had become Thomas's shadow, his helper, his student. Together they were more than a janitor and a starving child. They were builders of something fragile, something precious. Not just survival, but family. Not just food, but hope. And as Thomas left one evening carrying nothing but an empty bag and a heart too full for words, he realized what he had given them was more than bread. He had given them himself, and in return, they had given him something he thought he had lost long. A reason to live. The whispers spread faster than Thomas expected. A janitor carrying food into the alleys. A human spending nights among alien strays. The colony was alive with suspicion. Every corner he turned, every face he passed seemed sharper, watching. The risk had grown too large to ignore. One evening, as he finished his shift, his supervisor pulled him aside. The man's voice was cold, his eyes hard. "Be careful where you walk at night, Thomas. People talk, leaders listen. You don't want to end up on the wrong side of things." It was not advice, it was a warning. That night, as Thomas carried his bag into the tunnels, his heart was heavy. The children rushed to him as always, their eyes glowing with hope. They were thinner still, but stronger in spirit. The boy, coughing but proud, stood closest. Thomas placed the food down, watching them gather. But tonight he could not smile. The danger was closer than ever. He sat with them in the faint glow of the fixed lantern, his voice quiet, his words heavy. "Soon I may not be able to come here anymore," he said. The children stared at him, confused. The boy shook his head sharply as if refusing to believe. But Thomas continued, "If they find me, if they follow me, they will hurt you. I don't want that." Silence filled the chamber. The children clutched each other, one began to cry softly. The boy stepped forward, his silver eyes burning. "No leave," he whispered in broken human speech. Thomas felt his throat tighten. How could he leave them? How could he choose safety when they had no choice at all? That night he did not sleep. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The colony outside hummed with machines, but inside his chest, a storm raged. He thought of the broken promise of the leaders. He thought of the angry crowd shouting, "Humans first." And he thought of the glowing eyes waiting for him in the dark. What was he willing to risk? By morning, his decision was clear. Thomas walked not to his shift, but to the governor's hall. The guards sneered as he approached. "What business does a janitor have here?" But he pushed past them, his voice louder than it had ever been. "I want to speak to the leaders." Inside the hall, faces turned. Council members, officials, people in clean clothes who never smelled hunger. Thomas stood before them, his heart pounding. "They are starving," he said, his voice shaking but strong. "The alien children you promised to care for. They are alive. They are hidden in your alleys, in your tunnels, and you have done nothing." The hall erupted in whispers. Some scoffed, others laughed. One council member slammed his hand on the table. "Silence. These lies end here." But Thomas did not. "Stop. I've seen them. I've fed them. I've held their hands while they coughed in the dark. They are not shadows. They are not burdens. They are children." Gasps filled the hall. The guards moved forward, ready to drag him away. But then something unexpected happened. A small voice rang out from the doorway. It was the boy. He had followed Thomas, slipping past guards. His chest heaved. His cough shook him, but he stood tall. Behind him, more children appeared, their glowing eyes lighting the hall like stars. The crowd that had gathered outside gasped. The truth could no longer be denied. They were here. They were real. And they were starving. For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Then whispers began. Different whispers. Not of hate, but of shame. Not of anger, but of doubt. Faces turned pale. Leaders shifted uncomfortably. The broken promise stood naked in front of everyone. Thomas placed his hand gently on the boy's thin shoulder. His voice was steady now, stronger than ever. "You abandoned them, but not anymore, not while I breathe." The hall shook with noise. Some shouted in anger, others demanded action. The leaders could no longer pretend. The children's faces had spoken louder than Thomas ever could. That night, the colony was different. Not fixed, not healed, but different. Food was sent, shelters opened, whispers grew into voices of change. Not everyone supported it, many still hated. But the silence was broken, and once broken, it could not return. Thomas returned to the tunnels one last time. The children followed, him laughing softly for the first time. The boy stood beside him, his silver eyes brighter than ever. "You stay?" he asked. Thomas smiled faintly, tired but proud. "Always," he said. And in that moment, under the flickering light of a lantern they had fixed together, the janitor and the forgotten children became something no war, no crowd, no leader could erase. A family born from a stolen loaf of bread, a promise kept where others had failed, a choice that changed everything.